Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Communication and Religion's conference on the intersection of faith, politics, and rhetoric in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. My name is John Radwin, and I'm honored to serve as ICR Director and your host today. Sponsored by the Lilly Fellows Program, Seton Hall University is proud to present Communication and Religion in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, bringing together some of the foremost scholars in their fields to discuss and share their expertise with students, faculty, and the general public. Broadcast live to registrants across the country, the event will also be simulcast by Shemaru, a leading media and distribution company based in India. The views expressed at this conference are those of the participants. The university, qua university, neither endorses nor opposes any candidate or political party, but in the grand tradition of academic inquiry and freedom, brings you this conference, its scholars, and their views on what many have referred to as a critical juncture in both U.S. and world history. I am now happy to introduce today's second speaker, Dr. Robert Pallitto, PhD, JD, Professor of Political Science at Seton Hall University. A former public interest lawyer, Robert Pallitto earned his BA cum laude from Rutgers University, his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School, and his PhD from the New School for Social Research. As a lawyer, he was lead counsel or co-counsel in several precedent-setting New Jersey cases involving public entitlements and housing rights. Pallitto researches and writes on civil liberties, executive power, constitutional law, critical theory, and contemporary political thought. His latest book, In the Shadow of the Great Charter, was a study of the Magna Carta's influence on American constitutional law. His previous publications include two books, Presidential Secrecy in the Law and Torture and State Violence in the U.S. Pallitto has also authored and co-authored numerous articles for the scholarly and popular presses, as well as amicus briefs in several government secrecy cases. He comments frequently in the media on law and individual rights cases. Dr. Pallitto will be speaking with us today on Trump, the 2020 election, and the limits of ideology theory for about 1 hour, and will be followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. Please ask your questions via the chat feed, and by the end of today's event, please be sure to fill out the feedback form, also shared via the Q&A chat feed. I now give you Dr. Robert Pallitto.
Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Or can anybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to present today. So I'm a member of the faculty in the Department of Political Science and Public Affairs, College of Arts and Sciences at Seton Hall. And so I'm going to look at a political problem that has connections to religion. And that problem is, how can we understand the connections between religious belief and political power in the United States, and particularly in the imminent election? So one candidate for explaining these relationships would be theory of ideology. And so I'm going to do a couple of things today. The first is to give you some statistics and a quotation to set context for why we ought to be talking about a strong relationship between religious beliefs and political power in this election. Then I want to give you sort of the broad outlines of the theory of ideology, sort of generically, before applying it to questions of religion. And then the second thing that I want to do is to talk, or the third thing I should say, is to talk about some of the limits or challenges for the theory of ideology, and why it might not give us the kind of explanatory results that we would hope for. And then finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about sort of where do we go from here. In other words, if ideology theory is not adequate to explain some of the things that we're seeing and living with, what is left, or can we salvage any part of it? Is there an alternative that is plausible? Okay, so first off, I probably don't have to demonstrate the importance of connections between religious belief and political power, but I'm going to do it anyway in the interest of being thorough. And I'm going to start with a quote from everybody's favorite theorist of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville. So in Democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote, "So religion, which among Americans never directly takes part in the government of society, must be considered as the first of their political institutions. For if it does not give them the taste for liberty, it singularly facilitates their use of it." So we could read this quote a couple of different ways. For a theorist like me, I would say that he's gesturing toward what we call the liberty of the modern. So if the liberty of the ancients had to do with political participation and responsibility for self-government, the liberty of the moderns has to do with matters of conscience and freedom of conscience. And so many of the challenges, many of the disputes that we see today relating to freedom of conscience have to do with religion, and I think that's at least one of the things that de Tocqueville was getting at in that in that comment. So now for some statistics. The Pew Research Center has compiled statistics on religious participation and its connection with political participation. And I want to read you just a few of those statistics to sort of set the stage for why we want to talk about, why we need a sort of an explanatory frame to talk about this relationship of religion and political power. So first, among the white evangelicals who voted in the 2016 presidential election, 80% of them voted Republican. So among that group, there was a clear predominance of political affiliation, at least in that election, and we know that it had a significant effect. Secondly, when we talk about the presence of religion in American life, 73% of Republicans in the same survey say that they believe in God for certain. Another 17% believe that for somewhat certain that God exists. Among Democrats, 55% believe for certain, and another 20% believe somewhat certainly. 62% of independents believe in God for certain, and 21% believe somewhat for certain. So what you see is that there's a strong predominance across political affiliations of professing a belief in God, however defined, or however that belief is practiced. Among Catholic voters, 37% identify as Republican, 44% identify as Democrats. Among evangelical Protestants, 55% identify as Republicans, and 28% identify as Democrats. So those figures should show you that there is there's the potential for a number of clear and profound effects of religious belief and affiliation and practice on voting outcomes. So this raises a couple of different questions. Clearly, winning a presidential election gives the opportunity for a party and a person to garner or retain significant political power. Obviously, being able to do that is dependent on positive vote outcome. So how does a candidate secure votes? Well, one of the things that's done is by shaping beliefs of voters. In other words, voters identify with what they perceive as the candidate's set of preferences, positions, what the candidate stands for, not only in terms of concrete policy, but in terms of character. And so there's an opportunity for seeing numerous connections here. Ideology theory specifically is concerned with exploring the relationships between belief and power. So in the first use of the term, right after the French Revolution, Antoine de Tracy in 1796 used the term ideology for the first time that we know of to refer to the study of ideas. So there was no valence to it, whether we were talking about false ideas or powerful ideas, but simply to propose that there is a social science that focuses on the study of ideas. Over time, and particularly through the work of Karl Marx in the 19th century, we began to think of ideology theory predominantly as a study of relationships between beliefs and power. So not just any ideas and not just any effects of beliefs, but how do beliefs impact power relations? And of course, Marx famously talked about something called false consciousness, which was generated through the social relations of capitalism. Marx was a little bit ambiguous about whether this was something that just arose out of capitalist social conditions or whether it was a deliberate plan or program of a ruling group in society. You can find support for either of those views in Marx's work. Either way, there is this sort of clear indication that ideology is about power and power relationships. How are our beliefs shaped in ways that affect power? When you hear people talking about ideology today, especially in popular contexts, but even sometimes in scholarly contexts, it takes on a pejorative meaning. In other words, that if I say that something is ideological, I'm saying that it's manipulative, or at worst, that it's false. There's a joke about this, and like all academic jokes, it's not very funny, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. I have a theory. You have an opinion. She has an ideology. So in other words, I could not possibly be laboring under some kind of ideological delusion. If I believe something, it must be a robust and coherent a set of principles. Whereas for you, you may be deceived in what you believe. So we have to always navigate between this use of the word ideology in a pejorative sense and in the sense that that refers to a theory or body of theory. And so when I say the theory of ideology, I don't use it in the plural because I think there are common elements of this theory that you can trace through its use by various thinkers. So obviously starting with Marx in the 19th century, and Marx sees people alienated in various ways by the social relations of capitalism. And one of the things that happens is they come to accept the conditions under which they live as something inevitable that they can't do anything about. And of course, Marx has a solution to this. Workers become class conscious. They realize their positioning in history and how they can change history, and they do it. Hasn't happened, but that's the theory. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci added a significant piece to the theory of ideology by focusing on the role of intellectual agents. So for Gramsci, there were organic intellectuals embedded in prominent social groups at any period in time, whether it was the bourgeoisie, whether it was the proletariat. These intellectuals would be sort of waging a war to control discourse. In other words, while there was control of physically of bodies and territory, there is always going to be a struggle of control of discourse, shaping ideas, bringing together ideas to form a world picture. That's why Gramsci thought that all of us were potentially philosophers, because all of us have views of the world and all of us act on those views. So Gramsci sort of thickened Marx's theory of ideology by suggesting that there were active intellectual agents who helped to bring about a state of belief, which would then support or facilitate a group taking power. A little bit after Gramsci wrote, the Frankfurt School, particularly Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, and later Herbert Marcuse, added a piece to ideology theory that referred to cultural production. So that one of the things, one of the sort of realms in which this this contestation over meanings takes place, it isn't just about political discussion and explicitly political topics, but other areas of culture. So in cinema, in other popular entertainment, in the world of religion, in civic institutions, in civil society. Louis Althusser, structuralist Marxist, writing in the 1960s, adds the concept of interpolation. So for Althusser, the way that this process actually works, so that we all become good subjects of a ruling ideology, is that we respond to a system that names us and constructs us. And Althusser has this famous story where a police officer is walking down the street and a person encounters him, and the police officer says, "Hey, you there." And the pedestrian turns around and responds to the police officer because the pedestrian knows that this interpellation or this hailing is directed at him or her. And so the story sort of stands for how we recognize our place in society. So Althusser says, yes, it certainly is me, a worker, a soldier in this vale of tears. And by performing that response, the person becomes a subject of the ideology. Jumping ahead to the 1990s, Richard Rorty, the late American pragmatist philosopher, contributed to ideology theory in a negative way. I mean, if we want to sort of put it in terms of today's popular speech, he was so over it. So for Rorty, he said, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there is no longer any question that liberal democratic societies are the best way to maintain harmonious social relations, and the only governments that it makes sense to support or create are those that follow along those lines. So for Rorty, there was no longer any need for ideology because there was no longer any serious dispute about what is the best, at least what is pragmatically the best way for a society to be organized and for a government to be envisioned. So Rorty would say that if you don't agree, and if you're still arguing about these fundamental questions of political organization, then there's something wrong with you. Not that there's a struggle going on, but you don't objectively understand where we are now in history. And that might be a little bit of an oversimplification of Rorty, but just a little bit. So all of this sounds very neat and tidy, and you can probably think that this theory can be applied to anything. So how is it that Donald Trump managed to win an election with support of groups like white evangelicals in the statistics I quoted before, when in fact he has shown a disdain for many of the values that those believers profess to hold? Why is it that he openly bragged about sexually abusing women and still maintained those voters' support, and may well do so again in this election, whatever the ultimate outcome is? So the tempting answer is, well, it's about ideological control. So somehow Trump has created a state of belief, and he's able to successfully make those beliefs take hold among his supporters, and he maintains his political power, at least so far has come to power, and hopes to do so again. But when we look closer at ideology theory, we see some real problems. The critical theorist Raymond Geiss has broken down the phenomenon of ideology into three categories. So he says that if an ideological phenomenon is a false statement that helps someone to come to power, then this can happen in three ways, or it can be false in three ways. First, it can be genetically false, that there's something about the origin of the statement that is being disseminated so that people can believe it. For example, that it was fabricated by campaign advisors within a presidential campaign. Secondly, that a phenomenon is false because it's false functionally. So there may not be anything about the way the belief originated that's objectionable or false or questionable, but it works in a way that disadvantages people. So it's false or damaging or harmful in its application. And then finally, the one that's sort of easiest to grasp, at least, is that it's epistemically false. So the reasons why a person holds a certain belief are defective. They're factually wrong. A person didn't hear or understand properly, or has not bothered to check facts. In some way, there's something about the formation of the belief, not in its origin, not in its function, but simply in the epistemic content that it has. So a critique of a process of belief formation that's ideological, according to Geiss, has to fit into one of these categories. And I think the analytical division is pretty good. I mean, that does cover all the cases that usually arise. But there are a couple of problems here. And particularly with the epistemic conception of ideology. Some things can be demonstrably false. If I come on the screen here and tell you that today's Wednesday, or that the Earth is flat, or that the temperatures of the planet have not risen precipitously, in the last few decades, right? Those are statements that are factually false, and they can be easily disproven. But that doesn't cover the whole universe of claims that can function ideologically. For example, if I tell you that I think that work is the most noble activity that a human can undertake, and that anyone who works at any job is becoming more noble because of it, that's not a factually false statement. That's a value. A value is not false. You could point out to me that that belief has been used to support all sorts of unjust political arrangements, but it's not factually false. The same with desires. If I say that I desire to see a world in which wealth is more unevenly distributed than it already was, I can say that, and there's no way to falsify it, because you can't falsify a desire. You can tell me that the desire can lead to harmful results, but you can't tell me that the desire itself is false. Finally, when we talk about interests, right, we say that somehow a person who's being manipulated ideologically is being made to go against their own interests. So probably the most famous example would be in Marx's theory. Marx has a famous quote, religion is the opiate of the masses. And what Marx is saying is that people are made to believe in a heaven, an afterlife, in sort of Christian conception of heaven, because they will not focus on how terrible things are on earth. And if they're not focused on how terrible things are on earth, they won't look to change those conditions. So what does this have to do with interests? Well, we would say that a person has an interest in having a fair wage, having a secure job, and so this other thing that a person believes goes against that interest. But there's a problem here too, because if we're going to posit the interests that somebody else has or should have, we're presuming that there's some objective answer to this question. I have a friend who engages in various high-risk behaviors like smoking and drinking and not exercising, and I try to get him to live differently. He says, well, who wants to die healthy? I kind of see what he's saying, but I do. I want to die healthy. So the point is, I could say you're going against your own interests by living the way you do, but he would say, well, who are you to tell me what my interests are? Right? My interest is to use my body like you would use a car, and the car eventually breaks down, and you send it to the junkyard. So, in other words, if you're going to posit interests for someone else, right, you have to somehow have a prior explanation for why you know that those interests are more correct, objectively true, better than the ones that the other person thinks are superior. So this gets into a problem in economic theory of welfare versus autonomy. So when we think about what the government ought to do for us, right, what ought our relationship to the government be? Well, I could say, well, the government ought to promote our welfare. Everyone should have enough money to have a safe and secure life, to have health insurance, to have enough food, to live in a safe place, to have their kids be educated and have opportunities for growth and so forth, right? And I could say, well, these things are universally desired, and the government ought to promote them. But of course, on the other side of this equation, at least in economic theory, is the problem of autonomy. If I say these are things everyone else should want, and maybe there's someone who wants something different, then by saying these are the ends we promote, we sacrifice autonomy for welfare. And conversely, right, if we allow people to decide for themselves whether they want to drink 64-ounce sodas or drive 100 miles an hour or not have health insurance, right, then what we're doing is we're saying we're allowing people to choose autonomy over welfare, and even make decisions that are self-injurious so that they can say, I made this decision. I'm in a better position to know what my interests are. So I go into this sort of digression into economic theory because it shows how problematic this positing of an interest is. Ideology theory in its crudest form says people are made to act against their own interests by manipulation of belief states. Well, one of the problems here is we don't exactly know what those interests are. That question is problematic. And so in order to even make a credible claim that that we know what someone's interests are, we have to have perfect knowledge about that person's situation or ideal conditions, right? You may realize that you live in an area that generates certain health risks, whether it's air pollution or traffic or crime, and you might say, well, given those limitations in my life, I'm going to make a choice not to remain home or not to walk after dark or to wear a mask outdoors, right? And so you might say, I wouldn't choose those under ideal conditions. I wouldn't choose to do those things. And so the interests that I have are sort of subject to the conditions that I live in. All right, so that's kind of a very quick listing of the challenges to ideology theory. And there's just well, there are two more before I go on to the sort of where we go from here part of the talk. So one is, do we always know why we hold beliefs? In other words, the 20th century brings discoveries in psychoanalytic theory and psychology more generally, suggesting that there are things that we don't even know that we know. So remember Donald Rumsfeld talking about known unknowns and unknown knowns and so forth. Well, the theorist Slavoj Žižek has said there's another category, which is unknown knowns. There are things that we know, we don't know we know them. And of course, we're talking about repressed memory. We're talking about unconscious attachments that we can't fully articulate. These things play a big role in many of the sort of distortions of belief in the 20th and 21st century, including racism, right? Sometimes people's racism proceeds from unconscious beliefs. So agents don't always know the reasons why they hold beliefs. In Zizek's words, and this is also shared by Jürgen Habermas, ideology can function behind the backs of subjects, and that makes it a little bit harder to have sort of a straightforward program for how to combat these these processes. I'll get back to that a little bit later. But before we get there, you can see processes at work. For example, you can see people reacting to factually false pronouncements about COVID, about Black Lives Matter protests, whatever the case may be, and you can identify them. You can show the connection between what the person believes and effects on that person's life. Like, for example, if I say I think COVID is a myth, I'm not going to wear a mask, and then God forbid I get sick, right? So I believe something that was false, and I was harmed as a result. But that doesn't get you all the way to proving that an ideological process is at work, because it requires a sort of demonstration of what we call systematicity. In other words, things are operating in a systematic way. And so just saying that they're episodic occurrences of people engaging in self-injurious behavior doesn't show that it's a result of a system that sort of keeps bringing about these effects, and will do so predictably, and is doing it at the behest of a coordinated plan by some group, or even by a functioning of a social scientific law. So that's another challenge. Some people would resort to other options for explaining the kinds of things that I just described, short of ideology theory. So for Noam Chomsky, the foreign policy critic and generally cultural critic in the United States, who's also a linguist, he says that the problem is one of information control. If media companies are owned centrally, then the channels through which, and I don't mean channels on the television, but channels sort of in terms of pathways through which we receive information, are limited. And so it's not a matter of being tricked; it's a matter of not getting the information. And that's, you know, that is a serious argument. It's a complex argument, If we're going to explore it, we have to also acknowledge that information is available in a sort of a wider range and more easily to most of us. If you have access to a mobile phone or a computer, you can look up any fact you want in the moment, and and news is to some extent filtered for us, but we can find it. If we want to find contradictory accounts to the ones that we're used to seeing, we can do so. So this is not the time to go into a thorough sort of interrogation of Chomsky's theory about information control, but it's another gesture toward explaining these ideological phenomena that doesn't depend on simply a coordinated process of mystification or control. In totalitarian societies, particularly in the earlier 20th century, there's a simpler picture. So in the Stalinist Soviet Union or in Hitler's Germany, it wasn't a matter of deceiving people in order to maintain power. The control of the society was so complete, and Hannah Arendt does a powerful job of sort of illustrating this. The control of the society was so complete, and people were enlisted so fully that it wasn't so much about a false claim as it was there was no space for resistance. The whole person was caught up in the totalitarian social structure. So, for example, in Soviet Union, when Stalin first took power in the mid-20s, he persecuted the Russian Orthodox Church, members of the church, by killing them, exiling them, so forth. Sometime during World War II, Stalin thought that it would be advantageous for the church to play a supporting role as the nation tried to withstand German invasion. And so Stalin said, well, we used to say that the Russian Orthodox Church was an enemy of socialism. Now we're going to say it's a great supporter of the Soviet people. So what changed? Nothing. Stalin just decided one day this is expedient. And so this is not so much ideological control because you can't disagree with Stalin, right? I mean, there's a famous joke, another bad academic joke for the day. This will be the last one, I promise. Stalin's sitting around the Politburo and he's speaking and somebody sneezes. And so he says, who sneezed? And of course, nobody wants to answer. So he says to the guy next to him, I want the guards to take you out and shoot you. So they do. And the next person in line doesn't answer, and Stalin takes them out and has them shot. And so finally he goes around the table. There's one person left, and Stalin says, who sneezed? And this guy figures he's going to die anyway, so he says, okay, I did. And then Stalin says, God bless you. So again, not very funny, but the point of the joke is that there is really no space for critical interrogation of ideological phenomena because the control, the political control is total. So where does this leave us? You know the saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't out to get you. Well, I can paraphrase that saying and say, just because something is not happening systematically doesn't mean that it's not happening. So we can look at, I mean, there's sort of an endless list of these statements, propositions that can be demonstrated to be false, and yet people believe them. So if we can go way back 17 years, when the Iraq war began in 2003, there was a survey that showed that 69% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein likely was involved in the 9/11 attacks. Well, there was no evidence to this effect, and yet 69% of the public believed it. Is this a systematic process of ideological domination? Probably not. Is it a profoundly important fact that a false statistic like this could be so widely accepted? Yes. And so if we sort of update the list of examples here, we can add religious fundamentalists, as I said, who support a president who openly repudiates a lot of the fundamental principles of their religion. People who, and during the Trump administration, we've seen spokespeople refer to alternative facts. We've seen them. We've seen these sort of growing numbers of false statements that are cataloged by journalists. We see people within and outside the administration who deny that climate change exists, not to say that there's a particular explanation that's more powerful even, but to say that it isn't happening. people who say the pandemic is a hoax, people who recover from COVID and then continue to advocate for high-risk behaviors related to the disease. So there are all of these phenomena that look ideological, and yet they can't be easily captured under a coherent and cohesive ideology theory. So where does that leave us? Well, I cited Richard Rorty before, and I'm going to come back to him again because one of Rorty's oft repeated refrains was that we live in an age of irony, and he said it in a lot of different ways. He said it more eloquently than I can say it. He even wrote a book called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. So Rorty had all these ways in which we live in an ironic age, and we have to behave in ironic ways. And he has a couple of different facets to what that means. But before I talk about them, I want to say why it matters. So one of the things that happens in every presidential election is we ask on some level or another, what kind of a society do we want to be? So sometimes we vote. I mean, I know people who say the only thing that matters is that my investments remain safe and that I continue to be economically prosperous. But even if that's your reason for voting for a particular candidate, you still have a vision of how you want society to be. This is a version of Gramsci saying all people are philosophers, right? We all have a view of the world, right? And we act to either bring that that world about, or to challenge, a world that is different from it. So an election is a time to answer this question: what kind of a society do we want to be? I will suggest that this election, the question is posed even more sharply because, whatever you plan to do about whom to vote for, I mean, we're immersed in a number of crises right now. I mean, that's to deny that would be sort of factually false, I think, right? We're involved in a pandemic. We are involved in an economic recession. We are involved in a deeply divided crisis over racialized police violence. We have crises about our institutions, about what norms should our Congress and our president follow, right? So when we vote, we are voting, in a sense, for what kind of a society do we want to be. And, this is a topic for another day, but, that we're deeply divided at this time in history on what we want that country to look like. And it's hard to find any sort of neat division that captures all of the ranges of opinion on these problems. But what we do have in common is there is a set of values, I should say, that we at least profess to share. And I don't mean this in any sort of corny way, but I mean it in a factual way. Those values are partly derived from our Constitution. So in political theory, we teach that when a nation enacts a constitution, they don't only create a document, they constitute themselves as a nation. And so we see that when the United States constituted itself as a nation, there are principles of separation of powers, principle of bicameralism within the legislature. There is a principle of certain federal rights that are protected for individuals against the government, even though the Constitution itself doesn't guarantee that it's the judiciary that will protect those values. The values are affirmed and stated as worth protecting. So in public law terms, we call this constitutionalism. And so in other words, there's a set of shared rules, shared norms that sort of transcend and don't depend on who's in power, don't depend on where you sit, on the left or right side of the aisle, Democrat, Republican, that these norms hold together. Louis Hartz, the political philosopher, said that this is comparable to a Talmudic text. And that so the Supreme Court in our system tells us what the Talmudic text means, just like trained interpreters of the Talmud would do in the Jewish tradition. So the problem comes when the basic disagreement of whether that text is binding comes into question. So in a way, that's where we are now. And if we're in a post-ideological time, the post part of it is simply that we have these these constitutional norms that hold the nation together and constitute the nation, which are themselves under attack. And so where does that leave us as voters, as political actors, as members of various associations, whether it's a university or a family or a civic group or a party? And this is where irony comes in. So Richard Rorty talked about how there are various ways in which irony comes into our lives, and one of them is that we have to act as though these constitutional commitments are binding, even when we don't know factually whether they will remain binding. In another way, we have to, and sort of another sense of irony that we see in our current predicament is that we espouse values, racial equality, economic justice, limits of freedoms when those freedoms endanger others, like, for example, not wearing a mask, or not being insured, so that you create a greater risk of illness for others. So we adhere to these norms, and we seem to believe, we act as if our Constitution promotes and protects them, when we have deep skepticism about whether this whole system is actually working. And this is the predicament that we find ourselves in as we vote, as we are activists, as we discuss political topics. So we have to believe that these commitments, that this view of the society we want to be, is still possible, at the same time that we are worried that it won't be, and that these commitments to justice of various forms are not shared by the government, are not ever going to be cashed out. So I would suggest that trying to apply ideology theory to these phenomena of religious belief and seeming contradictions of religious belief in political behavior. Once we see that ideology theory is not a perfect explanatory fit, we don't just go home at that point. We say that yes, these phenomena are still occurring, even though the theory doesn't neatly capture them, and we find ourselves in this paradoxical situation where we have to still adhere to constitutional values when there may be a wider skepticism in the society about whether those values are really shared by people in government, by fellow citizens, and so forth. So that's where I'm going to leave the talk. I think I'm a little bit short of an hour, but that just means we have a half hour to ask questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pallitto. Very concise yet comprehensive summary of ideology theory, and then our current scenario where we face, I guess, irony. At this time, I'd like everybody to consider asking a question over in the live event Q&A chat feed. And to try to get us started, I'll ask one. If I'm a voter, which I am, and my wife is a brand new voter, which she is, how do I try to explain this ironic attitude? If you're somebody who's new to the country and somebody who understands the American ethos, is it a time where you can explain irony to somebody new when you might want to be instead encouraging patriotism, and irony might work against that? And as I'm looking at the feed right now, I'm afraid Dr. Pallitto hung up, so I don't want to answer my own question. I'll take this opportunity to do some announcements. At 5 o'clock today, we'll hear from Dr. Formicola. Welcome back.
Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to close the chat and I closed myself completely. So you had started out to say if you're a voter and if your wife is voting, and then I lost you.
Yeah, my wife is voting for the first time, and she's an immigrant, and she's a new American. And so something that I want to be an exciting and patriotic time, I think you did a good job explaining that we really are kind of in an age of irony, where there may be skepticism about whether these values are actually real, but we still have to act as if they're actually real. So I guess, what advice do you have for new voters? Because really, it's not just my wife, right? There's a lot of new voters, especially young people are new voters. And so to usher into an era where irony might be the only sane attitude, how do we explain this to new voters?
That's a great question. So I'm going to answer it with a biographical detail. I'm doing voter protection in Pennsylvania on election day, and I'm not gonna lie. I have a preference for how I want this election to turn out, but when I'm there in that role, I think my real responsibility, my only responsibility, is to help people to exercise their right to vote. So if someone comes up to me and says, here's how I'm voting, and it's different from the way I'm going to vote, I'm going to help them in the same way. And I think one of the crises we're facing right now is the core value of democracy is being sort of diminished. So it becomes a game in a way. How can we game this election to get a certain result, rather than saying, it's a sacred thing to be able to vote, and people have died not only here but in other countries for the opportunity to vote. So I think, and hopefully I'll maintain this for the entire 14 hours that I'm there, but I think the attitude is going to be, how can I help every person in this line answer every question they have and show how serious and important this act is, regardless of what levers you're pulling. So I do feel like it's. I mean, you see people around the country in early voting who've waited a long time. They've waited hours to vote. You see people who I know. My mother-in-law helped an elderly friend to vote early, and it was a real ordeal. This was in New Mexico. It was a real ordeal to get the documents together and so forth. So, I mean, I think that the strongest piece of advice I would have is, expect that people are going to treat, you as you exercise this right with total respect. And that's what we should all be doing. And hopefully after this election, we can restore some kind of a feeling about voting. It's not a zero-sum game. I mean, everyone who's a eligible voters should be able to vote, and sometimes eligibility needs to be expanded. In some states, they've contracted. And this is not a new. I mean, I know when we look at the English Civil War and some of the debates about parliamentary reforms after King Charles is dead, there's a question about whether everyone should be able to vote in the kingdom, or whether only people who own real property in the kingdom should be able to vote. So, I mean, we say, well, it's just an obvious yes to the question, should everyone be able to vote? It hasn't been that way as a matter of fact. And also there have been theoretical justifications for why it shouldn't be so. So there's this debate between sort of the Cromwell faction and the more populist faction about whether voting should be limited to property ownership or not. We've settled that question in the United States now, finally. But there are these other views. Like, no, everyone should not vote. Voting is is something that requires a certain amount of enlightenment or a certain privileged position, which I think is wrong. But I mean, that's one of the debates. So, short answer, I think that people should expect to be treated with respect as they exercise this fundamental right. And I mean, I'm going to see how that goes. Whether I see that happening, when I'm there trying to help.
Thank you for that answer. I'll do my best. We'll do our best. All right, I'm seeing audience questions show up in the chat feed. That's excellent. I'd encourage everybody else to use it. Freedom of speech is important, and I don't see these questions crossing the line, but they are pushing lines. So politics is something that people hold close to their hearts, and please don't feel censored. Just also please try to respect academic discourse. So here's the first one. It's from an anonymous poster. Have you asked people about some of Trump's ideologies and why they overlook some of the things you pointed out? Curious because choices are relative. The Democrats have a lot of destructive ideologies themselves and are equally racist and divisive. By the way, Biden was accused of rape but not investigated and makes terrible racist comments, so voters are very suspicious. I'm a freshman and my college experience is I can't speak freely.
Wow, that's a lot. All right, so where do I start? First of all, obviously, it's not the place for me to say you should vote for this person or that person. I would say that one of the unfortunate effects of the last 4 years is we are adrift when it comes to facts. Like there's nothing that we can agree on and say, okay, well, when the election ends, the loser of the election will leave the White House or not come to the White House. We can't say that white supremacy is bad, and so these things in the past, they've sort of acted as outer limits on discussions, and some of those limits are gone now. And so, obviously, we're always going to have disagreement. Our system is in a way set up for it. And so, I'm not going to say that I can iron out every possible disagreement. But what we do is try to gather all the information we have and make and make a judgment. So, there are allegations against this candidate. Are they credible? Who is making the allegations? How many are there? I mean, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I have these sort of methods that I use to assess credibility. Why would someone have a reason to lie? How many accounts are there? Are the accounts consistent? In evidence law, there's a phenomenon that says you can't introduce character evidence unless it shows tends to demonstrate a common plan. So these are all things, I'm not making them up. They're things that have come through the common law of evidence and been codified by different states. And so what we should do is we should consume information critically. And, if I say, this is what I believe and here are the facts supporting it, and you say, well, actually, I can show you that those facts are wrong. In this kind of idealized speech situation, right, we should be willing to modify our views. And that's what science is about, right? Science is you make a hypothesis that's falsifiable. And if it can't be falsified, then it's not science. So, I think there are ways to sort out some of these disputes. And I do it in my own family. My kids will come to me and say, well, I read this thing in the news. What do you think? Clearly, I have a little bit of, hopefully persuasive advantage with my own children, but still, I can say, okay, did you look at the source? What exactly is being claimed? So, that's the answer about the sort of facts part of it. Like, oh yeah, there are facts on both sides. That can be paralyzing. At some point you have to say, okay, well, I have two accounts. This is the one I'm going to believe. And we do this in our scholarship. We do this in our classrooms. One of my rules in a classroom is I have rules about, attacking or victimizing someone else in the class. Short of that, I encourage students to disagree with me because, otherwise I'm not doing my job. So I don't know. I can't speak to every space that the audience member encounters, but at least in the proper kind of classroom environment, you should feel free to say these things. And I might say I disagree with you, or I might say, there's a flaw in the analysis that you're using. You're falling victim to a logical fallacy, or the source that you're citing has been discredited, because hopefully by now, after years of teaching, I've got some of this knowledge accumulated. So yeah, I think we have to be critical but still make judgments about facts. In the classroom, I think all of us have a responsibility to foster discussion. And at some point, if the discussion becomes, because we're talking about things that concern people's fundamental identities, we may have to redirect the conversation, not to shut somebody up, but because we're balancing, open inquiry against someone feeling victimized or disrespected or threatened, in some way. All of us have things that are traumatic for us to talk about, and we shouldn't be forced to talk about them. At the same time, the professor has to make that judgment. Okay, are we in a point in the conversation where we've gotten beyond where we can have a respectful difference and we need to redirect, or let's talk about this? We're in a point in our history where we've got to have painful conversations about really important topics. So that's probably a longer answer than the audience member wanted, but there you go.
That's the answer I wanted, Dr. Pallitto. Thank you so much. This conference is an extension of the classroom, and debate and disagreement is vital. And the problem comes, as you say, when you cross lines where it becomes something that is potentially dangerous. And that's, I guess, one of the benefits of teams is we're not going to be starting fistfights here. We're going to be using our freedom of speech to explore important issues. Our next question comes from Mark Anthony Datz. He asks, or he says, and then asks, both sides are terrible. The first debate made our political process a laughingstock to the whole world. Robert's rules were completely discarded. Chris Wallace was a terrible moderator, allowing such mudslinging from both sides. How do we rise above the ideology and truly stand for a better country after this election? We can't go back on radicalizing each other and expecting a better country.
So I guess the question part of the comment is, how do we get beyond what we saw in the last presidential debate? I mean, it's like the Rashomon story. I mean, we're all looking at the same thing. We're looking at parts of it, and well, it's not a perfect illustration of the Rashomon story, but still, we're seeing a part. And I'm looking at the part for the candidate I don't like, and saying this is terrible. Someone else is saying the whole thing was terrible. Someone else saying the moderator's terrible. So I mean, maybe it's not a totally hopeless analogy, but I guess the thing is, there are norms get eroded over time often, and so if we see an event that looks so much like what we don't want to be, and we say, what have we become? It probably didn't happen at, what was it, 9 o'clock the debate started, or 8 o'clock. I think that these things develop over time. And what I saw, again, I probably don't see the event the same way as the audience member, but I guess I think of it as a process of norms being eroded. And the problem is that you can have one set of norms or norms in a particular area that are eroded, and then you have to try to sort of build them back up again. But when you have norms all across the board about how we refer to each other, what is presidential behavior, how important is character, the rules for decorum in the two chambers of Congress. So I mean, there's so many norms that are being shattered at the same time, and I think that's when we see something as extreme as that. And clearly, when I watched the event, I saw something different. I saw Biden in a position where he couldn't speak. He was being attacked in all these different ways. And I thought to myself, I mean, I've been in courtroom, situations, and what do? I mean, on the one hand, you say, well, I don't want to descend to that behavior, but then you run the risk of being, steamrolled. So, I mean, there's that element to it also. I mean, I'm not going to bore people with war stories, but I mean, I can think of times in trial and appellate courts where I felt like my opponent, or even one time a judge, was just running the proceeding in such a way that I had to object. I had to say, this is not right. And then afterwards, I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But if I hadn't, it might have ended up even worse. So yeah, that's another long answer.
Well, I'd like to remind everybody that there's a debate scheduled for tonight, and we will be hosting a watch party as part of this conference. So please consider tuning in with us, and hopefully we'll see some presidential discourse. Let's go into the next question from an anonymous poster. Have you considered some of the work on how people's ideologies might link to their distinct personalities? Not everyone buys into the same propaganda/elite ideology. Might they buy in or not, in part because they emote differently and find the different ideologies congenial or not to them due to their differing emotional and moral needs for security or openness, fear or attraction toward outsiders, etc.?
That's a great question. Have I considered it? Yes. Many years ago when I wrote my dissertation, it seems like it was another lifetime, but I was looking at some of that literature. And to be honest, it is another challenge to a coherent ideology theory, because, if you are going to say that, there's a process that could be put in motion that's going to shape everybody's belief in a certain direction, it assumes deep knowledge of the psyche of every person. It assumes that you can somehow target certain appeals. And I mean, look, in advertising, this is done. We know that. We know that especially now, targeted marketing has become an incredibly sophisticated thing. And I don't even have to. I can just say that, and everybody in this audience can think of examples in their recent experience. So the short answer is, yeah, I've thought about it, and it makes ideology theory even more problematic. I also feel like there's sort of a small subset of this, this inquiry, these kinds of inquiries that have to do with, can people be manipulated, working on their particular vulnerabilities, and I think they can. But getting somebody to buy a product is a much more limited endeavor than getting somebody to adopt your worldview. So I think you can see it happening most effectively, and it's easiest to explain in targeted marketing. I mean, I know of somebody in advertising who quit because she was asked to design a makeup product for women with low self-esteem. And she said, "That's it, I'm out of here." So, I mean, and this was a long time ago. So yeah, I think it's a critical observation. I think the literature is really interesting. It's a challenge to ideology theory. It is the way in which some critical race theorists have talked about a different kind of ideology theory. In other words, that there are these levels at which it operates, and it doesn't operate at the direction of any particular person or group, but still happens because of deeply entrenched ways of thinking about difference, about race, about power.
Thank you, Dr. Pallitto. Our next question comes from Cynthia. Cynthia asks, "This is an incredible challenge for the next president, no matter who it is, especially when so many are feeling that our Constitution no longer protects them and they are feeling disenfranchised. So many Gen Zers feel that the American dream is out of reach or a sham. This really explains the appeal of Bernie Sanders. He was a welfare over economy guy. Does this argue for a popular vote over the current electoral system?"
Well, I could punt to my colleagues who study electoral politics more closely than I do, but I mean, I would say there's some real problems with the Electoral College. That kind of a change is hard for me to envision. I mean, I feel like it does generate perverse results, and I would like to see a popular vote system replace it. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I'd love to be proven wrong, but well, I don't know if I should go to this way or not, but that sense of pessimism is very real, and I have kids who are either young adults or becoming young adults, and I think about the world for them and how maybe it was different for me. And it's kind of disheartening, like I want to encourage them and say, you can do anything you want, but you've got to overcome all these other things. So I guess what I'm saying is that feeling, the feeling that that the system is not working for this group, particularly young people, not only young people, low-income people, people in traditionally disadvantaged groups. So what do we do about this? I mean, I think, as you said, there's a tremendous challenge for the next president. It's not only for the president. I mean, it's a very heavy lift, and I mean, it sometimes the changes could start locally, I feel like the environment that we're in, I feel very strongly that in the university we can generate different ways of thinking, because in a way, we're not just here to do our jobs, we're here to produce knowledge and help people, learn about themselves. So electoral college, I'd like to see it go. I don't think it will. Sense of disenfranchisement pervasive, a lot of different groups. I hope that, all of us, if we get an opportunity to make, major change, if it's a new administration, I think there's a lot of space for that. And sometimes you hear, I don't know, you hear some public figures talking in a way that inspires me, like, okay, we've got problems, but we also have a history of being pragmatic and inventive. We have, with people with good faith, trying to work on things, and so that's there. And if not, how do you get out of bed in the morning? We have to believe that.
Thank you, Dr. Pallitto. I'd also, for those of you who were here at the last talk, and even if you weren't, we'll be posting all of these videos on the ICR webpage and Seton Hall's webpage. Dr. Arnett just spoke to us about Dorothy Day in the Catholic worker movement. And while she did protest big picture issues, most of her work was communitarian and local. And so that might be one angle to deal with disillusionment in the American dream, is there may be local dreams, local communities that can be built up, and especially the university. Let's move on to our next question from an anonymous poster. How would you characterize the impact of intersectionality and privilege in the conversation of ideology theory and this election?
Wow. Okay. So intersectionality, just, probably most of you know, but just to be sure. So when you have sort of multiple, what we call subject positions converging, so a person who is marginalized or endangered or victimized because of gender, because of race, because of sexual orientation, and sometimes those categories can intersect, and we have to respond, when we try to generate theory and develop theory, to say, okay, it's a different experience. We're not just looking at things through one of those lenses. So, I could say a lot about this. For one thing, the experience of this election means such a different thing for different people. The way that COVID has affected communities of color in the United States is dramatically different. I was listening to some statistics on a news program yesterday about how some groups in society, and I'm talking now about SES level, have been unaffected. Obviously, we've all been affected, but in terms of our prospects, our level of wealth, our ability to make a living, have food on the table and so forth, some people haven't been affected at all. Some people have been absolutely devastated, lost family members, lost jobs, unable to pay the rent, and just go on and on. So, in practical terms, I think, a focus on COVID is one of the things that's most important to voters sort of across the spectrum, at least, what the polling is telling us. I don't know that all of those voters are thinking about intersectionality. I don't know that they're all thinking about disproportionate effects by race and class and gender and so forth. But yeah, I know about some of these things directly and some of them indirectly. I work in a university, so I'm still employed. A lot of people aren't. I think one of the best things that we can do is to just simply bring issues to the public attention. Like I always think of Michael Harrington, the socialist writer who wrote The Other America in 1960. So people talk about, before Kennedy took office, the Eisenhower era and how everybody was content, and we had this sort of post-war prosperity that was touching everyone. And then Michael Harrington said, wait a minute, this is a question of people just not looking at what's out there. So he presented this compelling case for, okay, there's this other America out there, and it looks different from your neighborhood. It can be African American communities, it can be white communities in Appalachia, but people have to see it. And I think we've gotten pretty good. I don't mean we, like people in this audience, but we as a country have gotten pretty good at saying, I don't want to look at these things. So in a lot of cities, they're sort of clearing people who are panhandling, homeless people from the street, right? And then we don't have to look at it. We can go about, going to wherever we're going without thinking about it. But I think we have an obligation to look for those people, like I said, who are still employed, whose families haven't been devastated, by COVID, have an obligation to think, okay, how is this impact falling, and to listen, to people who are explaining, well, this may be your reality, that maybe, you had to wait too long for a takeout meal. My reality is that the person who was the main wage earner in our family died, and we were evicted, and we're living on the streets.
Thank you, Dr. Pallitto. That was a serious question. Well, really, they're all serious. It's a serious election. Our next question comes from Professor Hayner. Thanks so much for your informative talk. So, has irony been replaced by cynicism in the current political situation? Or are both parties on some level equally sincere about bringing about their vision of the good society?
Great question. I'm trying to figure out how do I answer this as a panelist and not as a person, because all right, well, I'm just going to go there. When I see the president holding up a Bible in front of a church when people have been tear gassed to clear out the space room, that's pretty cynical. So I'm not going to idealize anybody, but I do feel like there's a predominance of cynicism on one side, and I don't think it's naive to say that.
Thank you for being yourself and sharing your real opinion. As a professor, this is from Anonymous, as a professor and a lawyer, a profession where people engage in civil discourse and debate, how would you advise people with opposing views to discuss the election? Well,
some of the things have to do with classroom etiquette. So we try to talk from our own experience. We try to let other people talk. We don't we don't interrupt. I try to moderate to say, okay, that's what you think. What's your evidence? But if you're not in a classroom, maybe you're in a community meeting. There are some good rules, pragmatic rules that have been developed, like you talk about I statements. You don't say you have done this, but you say my experiences or I experience. That's one way. I think that in some cases you have to agree not to talk. Sorry to say, I have seen some situations where people can interact productively and positively, but they've got to steer away from some topics. That's not appropriate for the classroom because we can't censor in the classroom, but I'm talking about an interpersonal or workplace kinds of interactions. That sometimes that's the best option. And I've been in those situations myself where I've said to people, look, there's a lot we don't agree on, but we're trying to get this one thing done. And I respect that we're both working on that. But you can't do that in the classroom. You can't. You can shut out racist language or assaultive behavior, but you can't shut out, I have an idea that I want to propose. Otherwise, we're not doing our job right. Yeah, thank you for bringing it back to the classroom. The next question is a true 21st century question, and we are coming up on time. Okay. So if you're tired, please feel free to call time, and if you're able, we have many more questions. So this one is from Anonymous. How does the bubble algorithm that is built into social media platforms that keep you within a bubble affect people's ideological beliefs? Does it show that there is manipulation within the system? I really don't know. I guess I would parse the question a little bit and say, what is the system? What theological beliefs? What what isolation? Is there any way for the caller to phrase the question more precisely, or is that not in our
No,
capabilities.
not really. You can look at the Q&A feed and see the wording, or I can go back there and read it to you again if you like.
No, well, unfortunately, I think we got to move past that one because, yeah, I would want to know what we're, yeah.
Okay, well, we got 1 minute for Devin's question.
All right.
Devin's question is pretty precise. Devin asks, based on your legal background of evidence, do you hold the Democrats accountable for the false Russia accusations, false Kavanaugh accusations, etc.? There's a trend here that is disturbing, but no punishment rendered. Means justify the end is abuse of power.
Yeah, I don't, it's not as much of a question, I think, as a statement, and I don't really agree with the statement. Again, when you look at, this was not a criminal prosecution, right? And so the standard for carrying the burden of proof over the line was not reasonable doubt. It was essentially a job interview. So in the job interview, then the question becomes: were there enough creditable accusations to create a question about the job application? And so not only don't I see that as an abuse of power, I mean, I see it as, I mean, you couldn't. There is no. How do you hold someone accountable for in a punishment kind of outcome for a legislative proceeding? So I think the comparison is inapposite. Evidence pertains to legal proceedings, and even in administrative proceedings, the hearsay rule is different. So yeah, I think they're kind of inapposite.
Okay, thank you. We're at time. How are you feeling?
I could probably do one more question, but I was anticipating ending at 4:45, and so I'm supposed to be somewhere else at 5 o'clock. So let's do one more question.
Okay, we'll do one more, and this one is closer to the theme of our conference on communication and religion in the election. Emily says and asks, my current research is on Trump and religious rhetoric, specifically his lack of strong religious background and appeals to white evangelicals. Could you expand on how exactly he created this ideological control?
Well, it's funny because this is another example that this is kind of where I started an hour ago, that this is an example that shows the limits of ideology theory, because on the one hand, if you ask a voter, why are you voting for him? You might not see the person saying, showing that they have misinformation. They might just say, I want him to put a pro-life justice on the Supreme Court, or I want him to stand up for white people. So what is this? This is not about ideology in the traditional sense, because there's no way to say, okay, you're not making a rational decision. You're making a racist decision, but it's rational. You're saying, I want to preserve white privilege, and that's why I'm voting this way, right? So it's some of the responses I anticipate you would get wouldn't be a product of delusion. It would be a product of sort of clear-sighted, these are the interests that I have, and here's how this president would promote them. And sometimes you even see that people will avow, I don't like him, or I don't like the way he talks, I don't like the things he says, but he's getting the results about immigration or about the federal courts that I want. So that's not ideological, that's a political calculation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pallitto, especially for going over time. I want to take this opportunity to encourage everyone to fill out the feedback form. And as you do, please thank Dr. Pallitto for going over time. We greatly appreciate your sharing with us. I'm going to want to take a little break myself, but since we all are already over time, I will announce our upcoming events and put them over in the Q&A feed. So at 5 o'clock, we will hear from Dr. Formicola. She will be speaking on Catholics, the media, and the 2020 presidential election. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Tonight, we will have a presidential debate watch party from 8:50 to 10:30. At 8:50, Professor Kathy Zizek, who is the director of Seton Hall's Brownson Speech and Debate Team, will brief us on how to interpret and flow the arguments across the debate. And then during the debate itself, to incentivize sticking through, we will have debate watch bingo, which we learned about from the University of Utah. If the bingo card replaces the numbers with debate issues, and when you get all of a row, you post a picture and you'll win a Seton Hall bookstore gift card. And then tomorrow at 12:30, I will be joining Peter Beinart. He teaches political science and journalism at the City University of New York, and he's the newest op-ed writer for the New York Times. We will be discussing Judaism and Christianity in the 2020 election. So once again, thank you to Dr. Pallitto for this session. Thank you to all of our audience members, especially those who we couldn't get to your last questions. And I look forward to seeing you in 10 minutes as we hear from Dr. Formicola. Thank you all.